I would just say that even if you get the Shah's son in power in Iran, I bet a lot of money that after a short period of time, he'd be very interested in building nuclear weapons because, again, it makes good strategic sense.
So John Mearsheimer recently went on Glenn Greenwald's podcast and talked a little bit about why Israel and the United States' war against Iran backfired in the end, and why this is the case even if you listen to the stated objectives of those who supported this war. So, Mearsheimer is one of the greatest political analysts in the world and geopolitics, so I want to hear what he has to say about it. Let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I, of course, understand that Israel, I'm sure, has a part of their kind of national psyche that views the Iranians as their gravest threat and obviously doesn't want them to have nuclear weapons, in part out of fear that they're going to use it. But I think the bigger fear in both Israel and the United States about Iran getting nuclear weapons is that if Iran became a nuclear state, Israel would no longer be able to completely dominate the region as they've been doing. I mean, we've
got to agree with Glenn on that.
Seen over the last few years, not just Gaza, not just the West Bank. They just bombed Syria again this week. They took credit for the regime change there. They took land from Lebanon and bombed, obviously, Lebanon repeatedly over the last several years. They bombed Yemen. And now they just bombed Iran. So basically, they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, they bombed or invaded 5 or 6 countries since October 7th. Just think about that. And they're committing a genocide in Gaza on the bankroll of the U.S. Think about that too. And this was designed in some ways to take eyes off that, but people are going to pay attention to it again.
Because of their military superiority, it's been the policy of Washington to ensure that Israel maintains military superiority in that region. So I get the concern about Iran having nuclear weapons because they might use them. That's, you don't want to have You want to have fewer rather than more countries having nuclear weapons, I guess. But isn't the bigger fear that if Iran gets them, Israel would lose its ability to just bully the entire region and ultimately control the entire region as well?
Well, I think there's no question that Israel is in a position militarily now where it can act as a bully in the region. And we don't want to underestimate the importance of Israel's alliance with the United States. I mean, the two of them act as a tag team in the region. And that's a huge force multiplier for the Israelis. I have a slightly different view of this than you do. And I believe that if you go back to the period after Israel was created, the Israelis have had a deep-seated interest in basically wrecking all of their Arab neighbors. What's happening now to Syria, or what's happened to Syria over the past year and a half, is what the Israelis would like to do to Iran.
Yeah, we saw regime change there. Assad's regime was toppled. They no longer protect religious minorities and are hunting down Christians now, according to many reports, and executing them. And this was done on behalf of Al-Qaeda, by the way. Israel wanted to push us into that regime change war on the side of Al-Qaeda to topple Assad. The U.S. didn't get it directly, supposedly, but they did dump in $15 billion to Operation Timber Sycamore, and John McCain went over there and posed for some pictures with Al-Qaeda operatives there. So Israel wanted that war, even though it was against the expressed purpose of the United States, who was fighting against Al-Qaeda during the War on Terror. That's what we got, and that's clearly what Israel wants from Iran, that kind of regime change operation. He's right about this.
They want to fracture their neighbors, break them apart if possible. When the Israelis talk about regime change in Iran, they're talking about more than regime change. They want to break Iran into constituent parts. The Israelis, for example, have had a deep-seated interest in creating a Kurdish state. And I've always wondered why the Israelis were interested in creating a Kurdish state and paying so much attention to Kurdish nationalism. It's because if you created a Kurdish state, you would break apart Iraq, Iran, Syria, and even Turkey.
So I think what he's getting at is it would diffuse the power that currently exists in modern Middle Eastern countries into more entities that are less powerful, and they see that as more beneficial than fewer entities that are more powerful.
And this has long been their goal. It's a divide and conquer policy. So I think it's just important to understand that they do want to be the most powerful state in the region, as you were alluding to. But it's more than that. They believe that the way to do that is to be joined at the hip with the United States, number one. Number two, be the only state in the region that has nuclear weapons. Number three, be by far the most powerful conventional force in the region. And number four, break apart their rivals or put their rivals in a position where they're heavily dependent on the United States. This is what they've done with Jordan and with Egypt. Jordan and Egypt have hardly any maneuver room vis-a-vis Israel because they're economically dependent on Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam has told them that if they challenge Israel in any way, the United States will make them pay economically. So that's how you deal with Egypt and Jordan. And with countries like Syria, countries like Lebanon, countries like Iran, countries like Iraq, the basic goal there is to wreck those countries, to break them apart.
Yeah, I mean, what can be said more than the fact that they have a secret nuclear weapons program, which is already a deterrent toward other powers attacking them, and they won't abide by any IAEA inspections or restrictions or even admit this program exists. You saw, lawyers, if you saw that clip from Piers Morgan's show about a week ago, he invited an Israeli lawyer and he asked her, does Israel have nukes? And both him and Dave Smith laughed at her response because they can't answer this. But not only is that a deterrent, but also, like he says, and he calls it Uncle Sam, pushing its weight around in terms of sanctions and the threat of war if any of these powers get involved. That's why you don't see Israel attacked by its neighbors directly much anymore like you did in the 60s and 70s. You had the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. Instead, it's terrorist groups, which, by the way, Netanyahu supported. Netanyahu supported Hamas even as recently as 2 weeks before October 7th. Don't just take my word for it. You can Google this. He sent the head of Mossad to exchange money in Qatar to continue funding Hamas, and he did that for years prior with the mentality that, well, they'll never get a Palestinian state if it's Hamas in charge of things because no one will take them seriously as a negotiating partner and they'll destabilize the PLO. And that has actually worked, but it's come at the cost of many lives, including innocent Israelis and innocent Palestinians, and it's not something the U.S. should be involved in.
To make them dysfunctional. And that's the second goal. That's the regime change goal when you dig down deep.
So let me ask you about that then. Were there significant advances made in this bombing campaign that was pretty intense and pretty heavy in Iran, principally by Israel, but also by the United States, in terms of destabilizing and wrecking that country? Or do you think the government of Iran emerges still pretty strong and very difficult to dislodge? People have been trying to dislodge them for 45 years, since 1979, and they haven't gone anywhere. How do you see their strength and whether they've been sufficiently weakened and destabilized?
All the evidence, Glenn, is that the bombing campaign by Israel against Iran, which started, of course, on June 13th, has had exactly the opposite effect in terms of the leadership of Iran. The hardliners have taken over. The Revolutionary Guards are in control more than they ever were. The Ayatollah Khamenei has been weakened because he's been forced to basically go into hiding, and he's not in a position where he can command the country in any meaningful way. And furthermore, all the evidence is that the people are rallying around the flag. And we have a rich history of this happening every time a country launches a bombing campaign against another country for the purposes of regime change.
Yeah, this is the case. This has been the case in many other places. It's often the propaganda and war propaganda that support this narrative that says, well, the people will rise up and then overthrow their government if they see that another government is willing to topple it or flirt with toppling it. But we've seen the opposite effect. Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone has a great article on this because he was in Iran recently, and he has connections to people in Iran telling him that this has really galvanized opposition to the U.S. and Israel. So this makes sense as far as Mearsheimer is saying, and I want to see what he thinks about the actual strikes too.
We have a rich historical record here, and there is not a single instance, I want to emphasize, not a single instance where bombing from the air alone has caused regime change. And all the evidence is that it causes a rally around the flag effect. So the idea that the Israelis are going to cause regime change with their air campaign is not a serious argument. And if you look at what's happened over the past 12 days, it has not turned out that the country is on the verge of regime change.
That's right. They wanted the U.S. involved as a gambit to try to persuade Trump to put boots on the ground and get this regime change done, the same one that Netanyahu's wanted forever, on the U.S. bankroll with our soldiers involved. They didn't want to send their soldiers involved. They were hoping that they could persuade Trump that this was an existential threat to them and that Trump needed to follow through and finish the job. That's what John Bolton is complaining about on Twitter right now. And Mark Levin is complaining about on Twitter, these vile monsters that wanted to involve U.S. forces in a perilous regime change war that would have been more bloody and catastrophic than any of the other ones in the Middle East that the U.S. has done. So I'm with Mearsheimer here 100%. You can't enact regime change just through bombing campaigns or naval strikes. It just hasn't happened.
If anything, the regime is in a better situation today than it was on June 12th, the day before the campaign started. So this is a failure.
I think if Israelis and other advocates of regime change in Iran heard you say that, I've seen them do this before, that they would point to the counterexample of Libya, where, and Netanyahu specifically cited Gaddafi as the model he wanted Iran to follow. Imagine hearing that, like, I think the model we should give to Iran and make them follow is the one Gaddafi followed.
Yeah, he calls it the Libya model. He literally said that openly. Netanyahu hasn't hid the fact that that's what he wanted.
Which, of course, led to not just regime change, but him being raped to death on the street by a gang of madmen. And there, I think you can make the argument, can't you, that we did actually succeed in destroying the regime solely through a bombing campaign?
No, what happened there is that you had a ground war, right? We didn't have to invade, but we had proxies who had gone to war against Gaddafi, and we then came in with air power. But here the argument is that you come in with air power, there's no revolution, there's no war on the ground, and air power precipitates a revolution. That doesn't happen.
Yeah, he's right. This was a NATO alliance that overthrew Gaddafi with funding to militant rebel groups that caused the overthrow of his dynasty and his government. That's exactly what happened. And, it's picking a side between factions, and ultimately that culminated in a regime change. And then you were left with a new regime that, guess what? They allow slave trading and open market slave trading, completely violating individual rights in every regard there. And Gaddafi's weapons got scattered throughout sub-Saharan Africa as a result too. And it's harder to know even where those are now. So this was a U.S.-led NATO effort to foam that regime change via proxies through these rebel groups. The same thing that, the U.S. would like to consummate in Ukraine. They would want to overthrow Putin. Of course, that's an absurd endgame that, few people even talk about anymore. But that's what they did in Libya. And by the way, that wasn't a defensive alliance in that case. NATO was the last thing from a defensive alliance there. They were an offensive alliance with the purpose of overthrowing Gaddafi. Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapon program and all of his chemical weapons programs in the mid-2000s.
Again, to go back to the Libya case, the revolution had already started. There was, or the rebellion, call it what you want, and there was a huge ground war taking place. And that's when air power came in, And in those sorts of circumstances, you can do it, but not in this case.
I mean,
You
there
want to
are
remember.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you want to remember we had to invade Iraq.
Right.
We could not do a regime change in Iraq from the air. Otherwise, we would have done it. Remember?
They would have done it because they did it throughout the 90s. Clinton, there were targeted bombings throughout the 90s in Iraq, as well as a no-fly zone, and sanctions that starved what was thought to be, 500,000 to 1 million people. So yeah, he's right about that. You could have fomented regime change through an air campaign. It would have happened.
Remember shock and awe? We went in with shock and awe. It didn't lead to regime change. We had to go in, conquer the country, and then spend months looking for Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, and I remember the night of the Israeli bombing, or the second night, when we heard all these great stories about precise decapitations of the entire Iranian military commander structure, that, this was designed to ensure that the Iranians would be so overwhelmed by the show of force that they would essentially submit. And it was the same thing, shock and awe. We're going to shock and awe them into submission. And as you noted, that certainly didn't happen. But let me just ask you, in terms of, because one of the concerns I have is that although this part of the war for the moment has ended, meaning there's no more planes flying or missiles flying over Iran and killing people and destroying things, I can't believe that regime change is not still very much in the minds of many, many people in Washington and Tel Aviv. President Trump today said he didn't want regime change. He thinks the chaos that it would cause would be nowhere near worth the price.
He did say that, but Trump at the end of that statement, and I was glad to hear Trump say that, by the way, but that at the end of the statement he said, but they can't have nuclear. Well, what does that mean? Nuclear power, nuclear weapons? He's celebrating that they dismantled the nuclear weapons program, but he still says, but they can't have nuclear. So it just leaves a thread out there for the neocons to pick up in the future and Netanyahu to pick up in the future, drum up this propaganda again. They're weeks away from a nuclear weapon, like they've been saying for literally 33 years, my entire life, and maybe longer than that. Not my entire life, since I was a young child. But yeah, I agree with Glenn totally that there are going to be people still talking about this in the same way. This has not gone away.
But you certainly have the U.S. and Israel funding various factions. You have the MEK, other factions that are loyal to the Mossad or to the CIA or to the MI6 that, and I guess my question to you is, compared to Libya, are those significant? Are they, those kinds of militias and proxies, capable of fighting a meaningful ground war to bring about regime change if they also have the air cover from Israel and the U.S.?
Well, the fact is that they have not been able to do it up to now. And after what's happened over the past 12 days, the regime has every incentive to crack down on those groups and make sure that they can't cause any trouble. Now, can I say with 100% certainty that there won't be an uprising in 6 months or 12 months? No, I can't. It's very hard to say how this plays out over time inside of Iran. But the fact is that there is no evidence now of an uprising. And you also have a regime that has powerful incentives to make sure that that remains the case for the foreseeable future. So I don't think you're going to get regime change. But Glenn, then the question pops up, what happens if you do get regime change? What's the happy ending here? Are you telling me that we're going to get a new regime that is going to say, we don't want nuclear weapons. We don't want to cause Israel or the United States any trouble in the region?
The answer is no, no matter what. Even if you put in the Shah's son, even if you put in the most pro-democracy guy that the CIA calls as such, you will not get that.
And we're going to behave ourselves according to the dictates of Israel. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, the dream is to get the Shah's son, who was a puppet of the U.S. and Israel, back into power in Iran. He's going to fly from Paris or whatever and be welcomed with open arms by the Iranians. And I think you see he's being treated almost as like Juan Guaido, the legitimate president of Iran.
Like this heir apparent. Yeah, exactly.
or the monarch of Iran by multiple Western media outlets, and that clearly is the plan. You know, they had that Ahmed Shalabi, too, was going to take over Iraq and be so welcomed despite not having lived in Iraq for 40 years. That is the vision.
Yeah.
That is the vision. And if you believe that, I have a bridge I want to sell you. I mean, this is not going to happen. I would also point out to you, of course, when the revolution in Iran took place in 1979, it was the Shah who was overthrown. The Shah had an ambitious nuclear program, and the Shah was committed to acquiring nuclear weapons. And the reason is that it makes sense from Iran's point of view to have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
You know, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel and former defense minister as well, once said that he believed that Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons because it made so much sense. Just think about that statement.
Yeah.
He, of course, is a very smart man, and he is correct.
Yeah, it's hard to deny this, especially after everything Iran's gone through. This 12-day war that they're calling it, 600 Iranians died over this, innocents that didn't, this wasn't their fight. They were struck by Israel, and then the U.S. came in and did their own bombing run. And because of all the antagonism from the United States and from Israel toward Iran, why would you not seek them out, especially now? So this has only exacerbated the potential that they will gain nukes, and it's encouraged them to gain nukes. And it doesn't even look like the uranium was destroyed at Fordo. You have satellite images showing lines of trucks, large vehicles, presumably taking away that uranium weeks ago before these strikes, despite the fact that the Trump administration and Hegseth were out there at that press conference saying, we think we got it all. We think we destroyed it. Those tunnels are deep and there's only granite and rubble on top of it. And our U.S. troops did this and no other country's troops could do this. Well, despite all of that, it seems to have left, and this is going to come up again. You're going to see this war propaganda again. Netanyahu's going to talk about it again, and, if I was Iran, I would full speed ahead to nuclear weapons. It just makes sense. If you're an Iranian nationalist that wants to protect your country and its government at all costs, why would you not acquire nuclear weapons now? Look at North Korea. They don't mess with North Korea.
It makes eminently good sense for Iran to have nuclear weapons. I have said on numerous occasions in public that if I had been the Iranian national security advisor, they would have nuclear weapons today. I mean, the lesson of the past 12 days is that Iran was foolish not to get nuclear weapons, in my opinion. And the lesson now is to go out and get nuclear weapons, because if you had nuclear weapons, the Israelis and the Americans would not attack you.
100%. So this was not mission accomplished if the stated goal was to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Again, this will inspire them to get nuclear weapons. So, yeah, I guess I hope the Trump administration pretends that this is a propaganda victory for as long as possible, that they actually destroyed this nuclear weapons program. But something makes me think that, a few months down the line, maybe a few weeks, even if this ceasefire holds or doesn't hold, you're going to get this war propaganda again. Netanyahu will lead with it. He'll talk about how close they are to it. All the neocons will jump in line, talk regime change again. This is not going away.
So I would just say that even if you get the Shah's son in power in Iran, I bet a lot of money that after a short period of time, he'd be very interested in building nuclear weapons because, again, it makes good strategic sense.
Totally agreed. It just kind of highlights, and this is the ultimate example that underscores how senseless this whole campaign was. Even if that was your stated goal, to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, this was counterintuitive on the highest level imaginable. And they're not going to celebrate it like that. Trump's going to, use propaganda to sell the fact that this was a stunning success. And trust me, that doesn't leave out the fact that this was better compared, at least so far, better compared to the worst case scenarios where regime change actually did come about. Iran didn't practice restraint. And by the way, I think that's the only reason regime change didn't come. It's because Iran practiced remarkable restraint in its reprisal attack against the United States. They shot, a 12 or 13 missiles, I think, and they were either all shot down or one was set free, according to Trump. So they tipped him off. They just had to do this as a face-saving measure to say, hey, we fought back against the United States. They're going to have their own propaganda within Iran. They're going to say, hey, we beat back the might of the combined forces of Israel and the United States. And that's going to be a powerful propaganda campaign for them, too. You know, they didn't get toppled like so many people were hoping for, so many people wanted. And I think it's going to be full speed ahead to nukes at this point. You're going to see a second nuclear power in the Middle East, and I think that will actually create a semblance of détente in the region. I think that, you know, both Iran and Israel would be less likely to strike each other if that's the case, and even if they both had nukes, I think Israel would be more likely to use them first before Iran. Iran's in a defensive posture, and that's all they can really do because they've been threatened so much by the U.S. and the Israelis. They've seen a coup attempt in their country in 1953 that succeeded, replacing Mossadegh with the Shah. Then the Shah was overthrown in 79. The U.S. supported a bloody and catastrophic war against them in the form of the Iraq and Iran war. They supported Iraq's side at the beginning of that. They shot down a commercial airliner, that's Iran Air 655. They've sanctioned that regime about as much as the U.S. can sanction a regime. And Trump destroyed Soleimani. He also bombed them. He supported Israel's strike that took out some of their top brass. It's been all antagonism. So if you're Iran, if you're a good advisor in Iran, you're saying, Khomeini, we need to get nuclear weapons. No matter what your fatwa, your public-facing fatwa said against them, we need to get them now. And that's what I think they'll do. Ultimately, that's what's going to happen, really showing how senseless this whole thing was and how senseless it was for the U.S. to get wrapped up in this for the sake of Netanyahu's ambitions there and his interest in taking eyes off of Gaza, which will return there because it's a genocide in Gaza we're dealing with too. So I do want to hear what you guys have to say. Let me know down below. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with Mearsheimer? What are some of the spillover effects and ramifications of this war? And please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Glenn Greenwald too, he's awesome. And please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron. That would help support the channel a lot and I'd appreciate it. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out guys, catch you in the next one.